Like the anxiety-riddled hero of today's movie, I'm something of a hypochondriac. But if I found out there was a miniaturized man in a submersible flying around in my bloodstream, I'd be absolutely ecstatic about it. Instead of trying to get him out as quickly as possible, I'd make him stay in there until he could give me a full report on every single organ in my body, just so I know I'm not secretly dying of a flesh-eating disease in my meninges or something. Let me tell you, WebMD is no help in that department.
All you'll ever be.
Almost as soon as moving pictures were invented, people recognized the unique capabilities of the medium to produce special effects that would be impossible to pull off in any other way. One of the earliest camera tricks was the ability to transform people in new and magical ways, especially as it relates to size. The most notorious example comes from adaptations of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, where real-life psychologists get the name of a particularly bizarre condition in which patients have a warped perception of proportions. Science fiction quickly joined in on the craze, popularizing the idea of the shrink ray, and in film, this paved the way for the 1960s landmark film Fantastic Voyage, the most iconic use of the fictional technology to ever grace the silver screen. That was hardly the end of the trope, however, which brings us to the 1980s and Joe Dante, one of my absolute favorite filmmakers, who I'm shocked I haven't covered on this channel yet.
The neurotic grocery clerk Jack Putter has been given a prescription to go on vacation and avoid all excitement. Unfortunately, as he procures cruise tickets in preparation for a week of rest and relaxation, he is injected by a dying scientist. Little does he realize that in the syringe, the disgraced Navy test pilot Lieutenant Tuck Pendleton sits inside a microscopic submarine as part of a test involving miniaturization. Putter immediately finds himself hunted by evil corporate raiders, while the man inside his body needs him to find a piece of stolen technology before Tuck runs out of air.
Inspired by 1966's Fantastic Voyage, the writer Charles Chip Proser wrote a sci-fi spy thriller that was optioned by movie producer Peter Guber. After pitching the idea to Universal in the early 80s without success, he would pitch it again after moving over to Warner Brothers, who expressed more interest. Guber hired the scriptwriter Jeffrey Boehm to rework the entire thing, making it more of a comedy in the vein of a Martin and Lewis picture. It then attracted the interest of Steven Spielberg, who became an executive producer under Amblin Entertainment, with Warner Brothers agreeing to distribute. Several directors were considered for the project, including John Carpenter, Robert Zemeckis, Richard Donner, and even Spielberg himself, before it ultimately landed in the hands of Joe Dante, who had initially rejected the movie when it was a more serious script. Warner Brothers was thrilled to see Spielberg and Dante pair up once again following the massive success of Gremlins, and so they gave the pair plenty of freedom to make the movie they wanted. The lead producer was Michael Fennell, who had produced most of Dante's previous films, with John Peters, Kathleen Kennedy, and Frank Marshall signing on as executive producers alongside Peter Guber and Steven Spielberg. Hey, do you have a sci-fi classic you want me to cover? Drop it down in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you'd like to support what I do even more, please consider joining my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. If you still haven't gotten enough of me, I'm also the co-host of a couple of different podcasts, The Streaming Heap and From Here to Paternity, which are available wherever you get your podcasts, and I have a novel called Paradox that is available through Amazon. If all else fails though, you can always check out my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find written reviews of plenty more science fiction classics in both film and literature. Now then, with all that shameless self-promotion out of the way, let's move on. Innerspace was initially planned as a vehicle for Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had expressed interest in doing more comedies, and Michael J. Fox, whose career was at its peak following 1985's Back to the Future. However, Schwarzenegger ultimately passed on the project, at which point Fox also declined to be in it. The character of Tuck Pendleton was written to be closer to middle age, with Warren Beatty and Ted Danson offered the role, but they also considered younger actors like Tom Hanks. A 32-year-old Dennis Quaid took the part, as his relative youth was well masked by his world-weary but mischievous persona combined with a gravelly voice.
Jack, let the good times roll.
As for the nervous Jack Putter, they considered Mel Gibson, Rick Moranis, Woody Allen, and Robin Williams, before Martin Short was brought in. Dante was hesitant about Short, having only seen him in the sketch comedy SCTV, and worried that 2 hours of him would be too exhausting for audiences. But he was eventually won over by Short's physical acting chops and comedic timing. The role was even reworked on the fly to lean more heavily on physical humor. The two leads did a lot of ad-libbing on screen and a lot of celebrity impressions off-screen. Though the two men rarely appear together in the final film, they did work side by side throughout. Short's scenes were filmed first, with Quaid reading his lines through a hidden earpiece, and when Quaid filmed the majority of his scenes in the pod several weeks later, Short was there to do the same for him. This preserved their interactions and gave the characters a believable sense of camaraderie, so much so that audiences could easily fail to notice that you almost never see them together on screen. As for the female lead, Lydia, a ton of actresses were considered, and rather than naming them all aloud, here's a sampling in list form. This was one of the last roles filled, and it went to a relatively untested Meg Ryan, whose only previous role in a major motion picture was as Goose's wife in Top Gun. She met Dennis Quaid for the first time on the set of Innerspace, and the two would ultimately get married, and later divorced, as Hollywood relationships tend to go. Now, as for the rest of the cast, if I spent too much time on it, we'd be here all day, so here are the cliff notes. Robert Picardo, who had previously worked with Dante on Explorers and The Howling, plays the cowboy in what is easily my second favorite role of his behind the holographic doctor in Star Trek Voyager. Yes, he's wearing brownface and reinforcing some negative stereotypes, but no, I don't care.
Women love me, but you know that.
The great Kevin McCarthy, famous for Invasion of the Body Snatchers among other things, as well as being another Dante regular who appears in Piranha, Twilight Zone the movie, and The Howling, plays the villainous Scrimshaw. If you look carefully, you might even see a seed pod in his possession. William Schallert plays Jack's doctor, which is fitting as he had previously played the Doctor in The Incredible Shrinking Man, while Dante staple Dick Miller shows up as a cab driver. The character of Wendy was written specifically for Wendy Shaw, while the writer Fiona Lewis appears in her final live-action film appearance as Dr. Margaret Kanker. The Road Warrior's Vernon Wells plays the mute henchman Mr. Igo, and Dante's regular cinematographer, John Hora, was compensated for not being hired as such in Innerspace by being cast as the awkward scientist Ozzy Wexler. Speaking of awkward scientists, Dante wanted the engineers and scientists working on the main shrinking project to behave like real engineers and scientists, not like the neurotypicals you usually see in movies. As such, almost all of them are played by real workers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is where the film also got its technical advisor, Gentry Lee, who I know mostly as the writer of Arthur C. Clarke's Rama sequels. There's also an insane number of cameos in this movie, including director Joe Dante, screenwriter Jeffrey Boehm, stunt coordinator Glenn Randall, Rance Howard, father of Ron, and Chuck Jones, voice of Bugs Bunny et al., Martin Short's SCTV co-stars Andrea Martin and Joe Flaherty, and The Thing from Another World's Kenneth Tobey, who gets the funniest line in the film.
Play with it, pal. Don't talk to it.
Who was that?
Never mind.
Filming on Innerspace began in July of 1986 at Warner Bros. Soundstages in Burbank, followed by location shooting throughout San Francisco and the greater Los Angeles area. After that, principal photography finished at Industrial Light and Magic, where all the pod scenes were filmed. At ILM, Dennis Muren was in charge of overseeing all the visual effects. He wanted to distinguish the film from Fantastic Voyage by making the interior of the body look less clean and bright, and almost all of the effects were done in camera, with far less compositing than you might expect. Some reviewers, most notably Roger Ebert, would be convinced that the film uses real medical footage, which it doesn't, and only serves as a testament to how well Muren and ILM did their jobs. In fact, Innerspace would win the Academy Award for Visual Effects that year. Also noteworthy are the makeup effects, done by The Thing's Rob Bottin, and the music, done by the legendary Jerry Goldsmith. Initial screenings of the film were met with enthusiasm, and critics gave it very high marks, but for whatever reasons, the execs at Warner Bros. Completely botched the marketing, which is cited by everybody involved as the reason it only grossed $25.9 million domestically against a budget of $27 million, after releasing on July 1st of 1987. Innerspace found its legs on home video, however, where it reportedly did well enough to become moderately profitable. It's thought of today as a hit, and it certainly did nothing to hurt the careers of all the filmmakers, but at the time, it was considered a major disappointment. Joe Dante, whom I should disclose I listen to frequently on his podcast, The Movies That Made Me, considers it one of his best movies, in that it most closely resembles the vision he had for it, and it's something of a minor cult classic today. Thankfully, as far as I can tell, there's no talk of a remake or sequel, aside from a low-budget Spanish-language short film from a few years ago, but let's not give them any ideas, unless they're willing to pay me the big bucks to write it. Because, honestly speaking, I love this movie. Yeah, it's very dated, and I won't take issue with anyone who complains about Martin Short being a bit annoying, but I will say I think he's mostly toned down here. Mostly. It's also only slightly more scientifically literate than Spaceballs, but I'll let you in on a little secret that might blow your mind. Scientific accuracy isn't a necessary component of good science fiction. At the end of the day, though, I think it's entertaining as hell, especially every scene involving Robert Picardo. There's a thinly veiled subtext about commercialism, especially the commercialization of science given how the good scientists have a cobbled-together operation, whereas the openly money-hungry evil scientists have a straight-up Bond villain layer, combined with a light-hearted moral about believing in yourself and overcoming anxiety. Something I personally need on a day-to-day basis. Medication's great and all, but it doesn't shrink that rejection pile in my mail folder or the odd gas bubble that can very convincingly mimic a cardiac arrest. I mean, I recently spent hundreds of dollars to run on a treadmill at a hospital just so some doctor could tell me there's no risk of my heart exploding. And now you know how I spend your Patreon donations.
Isn't this great, Jack? I think we're making real progress here today.
Anyway, my personal hang-ups aside, Innerspace is a fun ride that deserves more love than it gets, and it is absolutely a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. What's your favorite movie about shrinking? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget those like and subscribe buttons while you're there. Thank you for watching, and until next time when we'll meet our first extraterrestrial journalist, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Well, the medieval remedy was to flay the skin off your body with brands of fire. I have no idea what the current thinking is.